This calming history story is designed to help your mind finally rest and guide you into deep REM sleep. You're tired, you've tried everything. Still, your mind won't rest. This calming story will help you drift off, deeply and peacefully. Most sleep videos just play music, but this one uses real stories from the past to help your mind relax deeply. Have you ever wondered what the world felt like before the ticking of clocks? What it was like to wake not to an alarm, but to the whisper of wind through olive branches? What kind of life you might have lived if your days were shaped not by schedules but by sunlight, and your conversations carried not over screens but under fig trees? What did the philosopher Socrates do when he wasn't debating in the marketplace? What filled the long, unrecorded hours of his quiet days? Did he ever plant herbs? Did he ever fall in love? Did he ever sit by the sea in silence, asking no questions at all? In this story, we're not here to analyze Socrates as history remembers him, not the trial, not the poison, not the legacy etched in books. We're here to drift beside him, to imagine the slower, forgotten parts of his life. The mornings, the meals, the mistakes no one recorded, the moments he simply listened. We'll walk the shaded streets of Athens before it stirs. We'll follow him to the docks. We'll sail with him to a quiet island on the Aegean wind. And there, we'll find something far more powerful than debate: presence. This is a story told slowly, deliberately, without urgency. A story not of answers, but of stillness. A story you may fall asleep to. And perhaps, even in sleep, you'll carry something with you from a day that once belonged to a man named Socrates. Let us begin, not with a great idea, not with a famous quote, but with a quiet morning in a world long gone. The Athenian morning begins before the city truly wakes. It begins not with the bustle of traders or the heated debates of the agora, but with the quieter sounds. The cooing of pigeons in the cracked tiles of a rooftop, the hollow knock of a wooden door gently swung open, the distant bleating of goats being led down a dusty path outside the city gates. Athens is not yet itself in the early hour. It is like a great mind stirring from sleep, its ideas still soft, its energy still distant. Socrates wakes easily. He never needed much sleep, and the years, he's around 70 now, have made his rest even lighter. His home is small, with stone walls rubbed smooth by time and use, and a single narrow window that lets in a sliver of the sky. There is no bed as we might know it. He sleeps on a woven mat, his head resting on a folded cloak. Simple, but enough. He rises without groaning or ceremony. His body, though aged, still serves him. His knees crack quietly. He reaches for the clay bowl near the door and pours water over his hands, letting it trickle into a basin beneath. He washes not for vanity, but for clarity. He always begins the day clean, not only in body, but in mind. Outside, the world is bathed in a bluish hue, not quite dawn, not quite dark. He steps through the low doorway, pausing to pull his himation around his shoulders. The fabric is coarse but well worn, smelling faintly of sun and smoke. He walks barefoot, as he always does, his soles hardened by years of wandering the city. The street is narrow. Small homes on either side are made of clay and timber, their doors still shut. A young boy, barely more than a shadow, is already sweeping dust from the threshold of a bakery. The scent of barley flour hangs faintly in the air, mixing with the warmth of ash and damp stone. Far off, a rooster offers a half-hearted crow as if embarrassed by its own enthusiasm. Socrates walks not with purpose, but with presence. Every few steps, he pauses. He kneels beside a crack in the stone and inspects a line of ants carrying crumbs. He squints up at a patch of moss clinging to a shaded wall. He nods to a stray dog curled beneath a cart. It is not that these things are important in the grand scheme, he would say, but that nothing is unimportant. At a small crossroads, an old man sits beside a wooden cart filled with olives, figs, and yesterday's bread. His eyes are clouded by age, but his hands move with practiced rhythm, arranging the goods without looking. Socrates stops, crouches beside the stall, and runs his fingers along the wrinkled skin of a fig. "Tell me, Theon," he says, not loud, "do you suppose the fig knows when it is ripe? Or is it the man who watches it that decides?" Theon smiles without looking up. This is how their mornings begin, more often than not, with questions no one expects to answer. "Perhaps it's the wasp who knows first," Theon mutters. "They always find it sweet before we do." Socrates chuckles, the sound like gravel tumbling softly. He does not buy a fig. He rarely buys anything. His needs are few and often met by friends, or by nothing at all. But the ritual matters more than the transaction. He stands again and walks on. As the sun climbs, so too does the city's breath quicken. A chorus of clattering pots echoes from a courtyard. A woman haggles with a fishmonger over the price of a small eel. Children chase one another between stalls, their sandals slapping against the stone. The scent of thyme and oregano rises with the heat. But Socrates, even in the middle of it, seems untouched by the rush. He walks at the same pace. He greets a young potter arranging jars, inquires how his fingers are healing. He pauses at a cistern to watch the play of light on the water's surface, his expression calm, almost amused, as if the shimmer alone contains an idea worth sitting with for hours. By the time he reaches the foot of the Acropolis, the shadows are shorter. The marble gleams softly, though the steps are still cool. He does not climb them today. He simply watches the pigeons perched along the architrave, tilting their heads as though listening to an ancient language only birds remember. He speaks to no gods. He offers no prayers. Instead, he lowers himself onto a stone bench, folds his cloak beneath him, and lets the sun find his face. This, perhaps more than any dialogue or doctrine, is Socrates' teaching. To sit, to notice, to ask questions, not because answers are needed, but because the act of asking softens the edges of the world. The morning passes this way, slowly, beautifully, unhurried and unnoticed. To the citizens of Athens, Socrates is a fixture. Some find him irritating, others ignore him entirely. But to those who linger, who listen, who sit near him on warm stones and quiet mornings, he becomes something more. A reminder that thought is not a weapon, but a companion. That a question can be a gift. And as the city leans toward noon, as its rhythms sharpen and its colors brighten, Socrates rises once more, his shadow shrinking beneath him. He turns not toward the agora or the stowers, not today. Today he walks toward the docks, toward the sea. But that is for another chapter. The city of Athens hums more loudly now. As the sun climbs higher, shadows shorten, and even the wind seems to shimmer with heat. The olive trees lining the narrow streets rustle, not from any real breeze, but from the slow, restless motion of insects and birds. From the agora, there comes the distant clang of bronze being worked, the rise and fall of merchant voices, and the faint rhythm of sandals hurried across stone. But Socrates has left that behind. His feet, bare and familiar with the roughness of the ground, carry him downward, always downward, along a path lined with low stone walls and wild herbs. The way to the docks is not far, but it is not straight either. It winds through the lower city, past potters' sheds, past small shrines half covered in ivy, past homes where children peek from doorways to watch him pass. He walks, as he always does, slowly, as though the world is not something to be moved through, but something to be noticed. He pauses by a well, not to drink, but to listen. A girl, perhaps no more than 8 or 9, is struggling to lift a bucket from the cool darkness below. Socrates watches for a moment, then gently kneels beside her. He doesn't help, not physically. He simply says, "It's not the weight that defeats us. It's how we pull." She looks at him, confused but curious. With some effort she tries again, this time lifting not by jerking the rope but by drawing it steadily, hand over hand. The bucket comes up more smoothly. She laughs. Socrates smiles, not proud, just present. He says nothing more. She runs off, carrying her water with the pride of someone who has discovered something on her own. By the time Socrates reaches the edge of the city, the scent of salt is already in the air. Piraeus, the port of Athens, sprawls before him like a great stone limb reaching into the sea. Ships of every shape and size rest along the quays, some tall and proud, their sails furled like wings at rest, others low and workmanlike, their hulls damp with sea spray and cargo. But the sound of the port is different from that of the city. It is busier, yes, but also deeper, layered. The slap of water against wood, the groan of ropes under tension, the gulls crying out to one another in the grey sky. And beneath it all, the murmur of voices, not just Athenian, but distant, foreign, coloured by islands and lands beyond imagining. Socrates does not stride into the thick of it. He wanders along the perimeter first, where fishermen mend nets in patient silence. He watches their fingers work the knots, eyes half-lidded, mouths chewing slowly on herbs or fish bones. He nods to one, a man with arms burned dark by the sun, and a scar along his jaw. "Why fix a net?" Socrates asks softly, "if the fish don't choose to be caught?" The fisherman shrugs, not unkindly. "Because I'm not waiting on the fish to think like a man." Socrates grins. He likes these exchanges, not because they win him anything, but because they are pieces of the world, puzzle fragments to be held, turned over, and quietly admired. He continues on. A young sailor, barely more than a boy, is unloading amphorae with 2 others near the loading docks. His tunic is stained with wine and sweat. He moves too quickly, eager to prove his strength. One amphora slips in his grasp and cracks at the neck. The wine bleeds out like blood onto the stone. The older sailors shout, but the boy just stares, embarrassed. Socrates steps closer, kneels beside the broken vessel, and dips his fingers into the wine. He brings it to his nose, inhales. "Thasian," he says, "not a cheap blend." The boy looks confused. Socrates goes on. "In some places, wine is sacred. In others, it is just something to forget the day. but everywhere it spills the same way. The boy still doesn't understand, but he softens. One of the older sailors laughs from nearby. "He's always like that," the man says. "Talks in riddles." Socrates shrugs. "Perhaps, but some riddles are easier to carry than regrets." He walks on. The center of the docks is busier. Here, carts roll by with goods from Egypt, Phoenicia, and beyond. Linen-wrapped bundles, olive oil in thick clay jugs, baskets of dates and nuts. A slave from Carthage is singing quietly as he guides a donkey down a slope. His voice is deep and clear, a lullaby maybe. Socrates listens, though he understands none of the words. Still, he hears the meaning. It is a song of memory, a song of heat and wide skies, a song of someone who is far from home. He stops beside a ship being prepared for departure. It is a medium-sized trading vessel, its sail painted with the red and black insignia of an Aegean merchant family. The captain, a weathered woman with thick arms and a gold ring in her ear, is barking orders in a voice that could split stone. Socrates watches her for a time, then calls out, "Do you ever let the sea choose your destination?" She looks over, squints, and smirks. "The sea doesn't care where I go, that's why I have to." "Still," he replies, "I imagine it whispers." She laughs and gestures toward a crate. "If you can carry something, philosopher, I'll let you hear it up close." He smiles but does not lift the crate. Instead, he steps aboard, careful not to trip on the gangplank, and stands quietly for a moment. The deck is warm beneath his feet. The ropes creak with the wind. He closes his eyes. The sea smell here is stronger, sharper, layered with kelp, salt, tar, and thyme. He can hear the ship groan faintly, as if dreaming of its voyage already. He speaks almost to himself. It's strange how a ship and a man are alike. They float not because they are light, but because they displace the water, because they make room. The captain, now busy coiling a rope, mutters, "Philosophy won't keep a boat dry." "No," Socrates agrees, "but it might keep the soul from sinking." She doesn't respond, but she doesn't disagree either. He disembarks. He spends another hour near the water, sitting on a low wall where the stone is warm and the gulls swoop low for scraps. He watches the horizon. Somewhere out there are the islands, Salamis, Delos, Paros, Samos, places with names like old songs. He wonders for a moment what it would be like to leave the city, not forever, just for a time, to see how others live, how they think, how they ask their questions. He had spoken once, years ago, to a man from Naxos, a stonemason. The man had described his village as a place where goats climbed higher than the houses and everyone knew each other's debts. Socrates had liked that image, not the debts, but the intimacy, the closeness of things. Here in Athens, everything was large. The buildings, the ambitions, the speeches. But on the islands, he imagined, life was smaller in scale and perhaps larger in meaning. He runs his hand along the stone ledge. It is rough, salt-bitten. He lets the sun warm his shoulders. A young woman sits beside him, uninvited but welcome. She has a basket of herbs on her lap and wears a tunic dyed with indigo. Her eyes are dark and steady. She offers him a sprig of marjoram. "For the nerves," she says. Socrates accepts it, rolls it between his fingers. The scent is strong, earthy, peppery. "Do you believe the plants speak?" he asks her. "They do," she says, "just not in your kind of words." He nods. She rises, walks away, and leaves him with the marjoram. As the sun moves westward, Socrates finally stands. He has no destination in mind, but he feels the sea's call more deeply now. The breeze carries the cry of gulls and the rustle of sails being hoisted. He does not plan to sail today, but perhaps soon, perhaps tomorrow or the day after. One cannot learn everything in the city. And as he walks slowly back toward the edge of Piraeus, toward a small taverna where an old friend might be stirring a pot of lentils, he is still thinking about the sea and about questions that do not need answering. The docks, in all their noise and motion, had offered something gentle after all. A kind of silence that exists beneath activity, a stillness wrapped in movement. And Socrates, lover of wisdom and watcher of men, carries it with him, in the sand still clinging to his toes, in the briny air in his beard, and in the memory of a cracked amphora and a child's success at the well. By morning, the sea breeze had turned, carrying with it the scent of citrus and cypress. The sky over Piraeus stretched clear and blue, but not too bright, like a washed canvas left out to dry. Socrates arrived at the port just after sunrise, his cloak folded over one shoulder, a clay flask of watered wine swinging from his belt. There was a small vessel set to depart just after the tide turned, a short journey, no more than a half-day sail to the nearby island of Aegean. It was not a trading ship nor a warship, but a humble fishing boat pressed into occasional use for those who could pay a little or who knew the right people. Socrates, as always, carried no coin, but the old sailor who captained the boat had once shared a winter fire with him in the foothills above Eleusis and still remembered the warmth of that conversation. "You ask the strangest questions," the man said now, tying a rope to a worn wooden cleat. "But you never ask for much." Socrates only nodded. There were 5 passengers that morning, a potter delivering ceramic bowls, a mother with 2 daughters headed to visit family, and Socrates, who said only that he was going to listen to the sea more closely. The captain, too old to argue, let that stand. The boat itself was long and narrow, built more for stability than speed. Its oars had seen better years, and the sail was patched with canvas of different colors, giving it the look of a mended tunic. But it held together. That was enough. As they pushed off from the dock, the city began to recede, not all at once, but gently, like a thought drifting from the front of the mind. The stone buildings, once so permanent, began to blur with the hills. The cries of merchants and the clatter of hooves softened into something quieter, and the sea, patient as ever, welcomed them with open arms. The first hour passed in silence. The women on board whispered to one another, their hands busy with small tasks, braiding hair, sorting lentils, fingering a clay charm for luck. The potter dozed. Socrates sat with his back against a bundle of netting, one leg drawn up, his eyes watching the waves without really watching. The Aegean, in that hour, was everything at once: blue, grey, green, silver. It shimmered in the morning sun, surface rippling with small, polite waves, each one folding into the next like pages in a well-worn book. The air tasted of salt and thyme. Seagulls circled high above, calling to one another with laughter-like cries. Socrates did not speak for a long time, but when he did, it was to no one in particular. "There are truths in this world," he said softly, "that are not found in scrolls or schools. Some of them only speak when we are quiet enough to hear them." The sailor, sitting cross-legged near the tiller, glanced at him sideways. "Like fish?" Socrates smiled. "Yes. Some truths swim like fish, silent, shimmering, and just out of reach." It was around the third hour when the coastline of the island appeared ahead, low and green against the sky. The hills of Kia were gentle, sloping down to meet the water like hands folded in prayer. From this distance, one could make out terraced farms, a scattering of goats, and a whitewashed building perched on a ridge, perhaps a shrine, perhaps a home. And somewhere, further inland, was a place Socrates had not seen in many years. As the boat neared the inlet, memories began to unfold in his mind, not with urgency, but with the slow unfurling of a scroll left untouched for too long. He had not planned to think of her, and yet he found himself doing so in that soft, sea-blown silence. Her name had been Myrene. She was not a noblewoman, nor a priestess, nor anyone history would remember. But she had known how to read the sky, the way the swallows flew low before rain, the way certain stars disappeared before the harvest. She had kept bees, had carved small idols from olive wood, and once showed him how to tell time by the shape of shadows cast on a round stone. They had met when Socrates was younger, not a boy, but not yet the man who walked through Athens with questions for every craftsman. He had come to the island after a skirmish in the north, nursing a wound to his leg and to his pride. A friend had brought him there to recover, and Myrene had brought him warmth when the fire didn't quite reach. She was not beautiful in the way poets describe. Her teeth were uneven, and her laugh often arrived too loudly. But there was something in her, a steadiness, like the trunk of a cypress tree bending but never breaking. She listened the way Socrates spoke, fully with her whole self. And when she asked questions, they were not to challenge, but to understand. They had not loved in the way of great tragedies or songs. There had been no oaths, no torn garments, no promises under the moon. Only the quiet kind of love, the sharing of figs, the brushing of shoulders at the hearth, the exchange of glances that meant, "I see you," and "I'm still here." He had left, eventually, as he always did. The city had called him back, not with trumpets, but with the pull of unfinished questions. Myrene had kissed his forehead and placed a sprig of sage in his cloak. "For the path ahead," she said. He had never seen her again. The boat docked at a small jetty just before midday. The passengers disembarked one by one, stepping carefully onto the uneven planks. Socrates lingered at the edge, his eyes on the hills. He wondered if she was still alive, if she still kept bees, if she still wore that same linen shawl embroidered with birds. He did not expect answers. The captain called out, "Will you return with us tomorrow?" Socrates thought for a moment, then shook his head. Not yet. He stepped onto the island. The air here was different, sweeter somehow. The herbs grew wild, less trampled than those near the city. The cicadas sang louder. The paths were narrower and less worn. He walked uphill, past groves of almond trees and fig, past goats that regarded him with indifferent eyes. The houses here were made of white stone, their windows small, their doors painted in faded hues of blue and green. No one rushed. A boy waved as he passed. An old woman offered him a cup of water without asking his name. There was a bench just outside the town, beneath an old pine tree overlooking the sea. Socrates sat there, drawing his cloak tighter against the wind. He stayed there most of the afternoon, saying little, doing nothing. He watched clouds move like boats across the sky. He listened to the bees as they darted from flower to flower. He thought of Myrene's hands, always stained with lavender and wax. He thought of the silence they used to share, the kind that wasn't empty. Eventually, a young man approached. He had the walk of someone used to the island's slopes, and a face not unlike hers. Sharp eyes, a quiet smile. "You're the one from Athens," the young man said. "She spoke of you." Socrates looked at him. "She?" "My mother, Myrene." Socrates felt something stir in him, not pain exactly, but the ache of something ancient and gentle. "She's well." The young man nodded. "She passed last spring, quietly, with the bees still humming." Socrates did not speak for a while. "I'm glad," he said finally, "that she stayed close to the flowers." The young man handed him a folded cloth. "She left this for you. Said you might return one day." Inside was a small carving, a bee shaped in olive wood. Simple, beautiful. Socrates turned it over in his palm. He said nothing, just held it. The sun began to lower, turning the sea to bronze. The hills grew long shadows. Somewhere nearby, a lyre was being played, the notes drifting on the air like dandelion seeds. Socrates remained on the island that night, not in a house but beneath the stars. He lay on a blanket of woven reeds, the bee carving resting near his head. And in that quiet, beneath the slow wheel of constellations, he felt something close to love again, not as fire, but as warmth. Not as longing, but as memory. The kind of love that stays, even when the person does not. The day after Socrates arrived on Kea, he woke just before sunrise, not to the harsh clamor of the Athenian port, but to the slow murmur of life unfolding quietly all around him. Roosters crowed in no particular hurry. A goat bleated once, then fell back into silence. Wind moved gently through the almond trees. The world was still, but not dead. It was merely unpressured. He had slept under the open sky, as he often did when the season allowed. The mat beneath him was coarse but clean. Someone, perhaps the young man from the day before, had placed a folded cloak over him during the night. Not to disturb, just to warm. Such gestures, Socrates thought, were more telling than words. He rose slowly, his joints stiff but cooperative. The small carved bee Myrene had left for him remained where he had set it beside his head. He picked it up, ran his thumb across its tiny wings, and placed it carefully in the satchel he carried beneath his cloak. The village, still wrapped in morning haze, was just beginning to stir. The homes were close together, whitewashed and mostly single-storied. Each had its own tiny courtyard, with herbs growing in terracotta pots and ropes strung with drying laundry. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of thyme and fresh dough. Socrates wandered with no direction, letting his feet choose the path. As he passed, people greeted him politely, not with curiosity or suspicion, but with the easy acceptance that comes in places where everyone knows there's no need to rush into anything. By the edge of the village, he came upon a cluster of hives, not grand stone ones, but simple, constructed from hollowed logs and pottery jars with lids of clay. They were nestled beneath fig trees, shaded from the harshest light, humming with life. Bees moved in and out of the narrow holes with tireless rhythm. An older woman stood nearby, her sleeves rolled, her hands gloved with fabric dipped in ash. She held a bowl of honeycomb, dripping gold in the soft morning light. "You're the philosopher," she said, not as a question. Socrates smiled. "I am someone who thinks more than is probably useful." She laughed once. "You and Myrene had that in common." He stepped closer, careful not to disturb the bees. "You knew her well?" "I was her cousin," the woman said, "though she always said we were more like sisters. She tended these hives with more love than most tend their children. She said the bees didn't lie. They built what they needed, took only what was required, and gave back more than they kept." Socrates watched the bees for a long moment. "She used to say things like that to me, too." "She said you might come back one day," the woman added, her tone gentler now. "She even left your old stool by the lemon tree. It's cracked, but we couldn't bear to burn it." Socrates said nothing for a while. The bowl of honeycomb in her hand was beginning to fill with sunlight. He watched it glisten. "She once told me that a broken stool could still support a whole man if he sat carefully enough. That sounds like her." They shared a moment of quiet. Around them, the bees continued their work, uninterested in old men or memories. Their world was simpler, or perhaps wiser. Later that morning, the same woman invited Socrates to the house Myrene had lived in. It was small and unremarkable in the way all true homes are. A single room divided by linen curtains. The hearth was still blackened from its last fire. Shelves of dried herbs lined one wall: lavender, sage, marjoram, mint. Beside them, bundles of reed paper, each one tied with colored string. "She wrote more than people realized," the cousin explained. "Not poems, really. Observations, thoughts. Sometimes just a single sentence." She handed Socrates one. It read, "The figs were sweeter today, but not because the sun was brighter. I think I waited longer." Socrates ran his finger along the ink, then folded the paper again and returned it to the bundle. "She didn't need to call herself a philosopher," he said. "She already lived like one." That afternoon, he helped carry a tray of loaves from the communal oven back to the square. The baker, a stout man with flour on his cheeks, laughed when Socrates commented on the perfection of the crust. "You Athenians think too much," the baker said. "A good loaf isn't philosophy. It's timing, heat, and a little bit of luck." "But even in bread there is wisdom," Socrates replied. "You cannot rush it, you cannot force it, you can only prepare and then trust it to rise." The baker paused, then handed him a warm roll, no charge. "Myrene used to say things like that," he said. "Maybe you did belong here once." Socrates ate the bread slowly, sitting in the shade of a vine-covered pergola. The square was alive, but not noisy. Children played with a hoop, a shepherd whittled wood in the corner, two old women argued gently about the best time to prune lemon trees. He had no desire to speak. For once, there were no questions to ask. The days passed this way, not eventfully, but meaningfully. Each morning he visited the hives, sometimes alone, sometimes with Myrene's cousin. He learned how to coax bees gently, how to lift the lid of the jar without startling them, how to whisper to them without words. In the afternoons he wandered the terraces beyond the village. He sat by small shrines, one to Demeter, another to an unnamed local spirit, and watched the wind move through fields of barley. He traced his fingers along the dry stone walls, still warm from the sun. At night, he lay under the stars and spoke aloud to no one. One evening, as the moon rose full and yellow over the hills, he returned to Myrene's house. The door creaked just slightly when opened. Inside, it smelled of rosemary and old smoke. He found himself drawn to a box beneath her cot. Inside it were small things: a ring made of bone, a pair of woolen socks neatly mended, and a folded square of parchment. He opened it. "You always asked where love goes when it's done," she had written in her careful hand. "I think it doesn't go. I think it waits, like bees in winter." Socrates folded the note slowly, pressing its creases down with the flat of his palm. He replaced it in the box, then stood for a long while, unmoving. Outside, the cicadas had begun their song. He did not cry, but he did not sleep either. Instead, he sat by the lemon tree beside the cracked stool she had kept. It groaned under his weight, but held. The moonlight dappled the earth in shifting patterns. Somewhere nearby, a bee buzzed in its sleep. And Socrates, who had once believed that wisdom came only from words, began to understand that sometimes, it came from waiting, from stillness, and from love that lingered quietly in the folds of daily life. Mornings on Kia had become a ritual for Socrates. Each day began with mist clinging to the hills, a cup of cool water from the well, and a slow walk through Myrene's garden. Her presence still felt in the soil, in the way the rosemary leaned, in the smooth stone she once used to weigh down sprigs of thyme. Though she was gone, Socrates found himself speaking to her softly, often aloud. Not as prayer, not as longing, but as habit. "Myrene," he murmured one morning, running his fingers across a thyme stalk. "You always knew when to speak, and when silence could say more." There were no answers. And he didn't expect any. He had begun writing her letters, not to send, not to keep, just to write. "The rosemary is blooming again. A boy brought thyme tied with a shoelace. You'd have smiled. You always trusted the small gestures more than the grand ones." He tucked the letters under a stone near the olive tree. No ceremony, just stillness. Later that week, he climbed the path to a hillside overlook the villagers said Myrene used to visit. There, under the shade of a lone olive tree, he looked out across the terraced fields and whispered, "This feels like a place to remember." And it was. Her cousin later gave him a box Myrene had kept. Inside, small things: dried flowers, a carved comb, a note folded neatly. "When I'm gone, let them take the comb, but leave the honey where it falls." Socrates read that line again and again. He didn't need to explain it. He felt it. In the days that followed, he spent less time talking, more time listening, to bees, to wind, to the garden. Her rhythm had become his rhythm. He no longer wondered where she had gone. He wondered where she still lived, and in each slow, quiet day, he understood. She had not left. She had taken root in the stillness. The garden had grown wild in Myrene's absence. Socrates didn't try to fix it. He simply began spending his mornings in the soil, brushing aside dry leaves, feeling the difference between earth that needed water and earth that needed rest. It wasn't about gardening. It was about noticing. Each time he touched a plant, he thought of her. The way she'd tuck marjoram under her thumb, how she'd whisper to the bees as if they understood. Without intending to, he had begun to mirror her gestures, pruning like she did, slicing bread the same way, waiting between words instead of rushing to fill the silence. One afternoon, her cousin showed him a bundle of parchment she had left behind. Not letters, just observations. The figs were sweeter today, not because of the sun. I think I waited longer. He read it again and again. Her voice, quiet as it was, had never really gone. The villagers began to visit, not for philosophy, but for herbs, for stories, for warmth. One brought honey, another left figs. A child offered a crayon drawing of a woman with bees in her hair. He placed it on the shelf beside the small wooden bee Myrene had carved for him years ago. When it rained, he stayed inside, listening to the water trickle from the roof, grateful. She had once said, "Sometimes the world waters itself. We're only asked to stay dry and thankful." And that's what he did. He sat, quietly, near the lemon tree she once planted, and let the stillness teach him what the city never could. The olive tree had grown a little sideways, as if it had once been caught mid-bow and never quite stood upright again. Its roots coiled outward across the hard ground, pressing their way between pale stones and tufts of thyme. Socrates sat beneath it each morning now, after watering the garden and checking the bees. The stone at the base, where he rested his writing board, had flattened from years of someone else having done the same. Perhaps Myrene had sat here too. Perhaps she had also watched the distant sea from this exact spot, the way it shimmered under the rising sun like liquid silver or turned dark and cold when clouds came rolling over the ridgelines. The coast below stretched out in gentle arcs, dotted with white homes, fig groves and sun-bleached rocks. And beyond that, the sea, eternal and unknowable, reached toward other islands, other lands, as if always thinking of somewhere else. He had seen many places in his life, but the Aegean held something particular. It didn't demand attention like the grandeur of Delphi or the marble majesty of the Acropolis. No, the Aegean whispered. It lulled. It taught by simply being. Like a friend, content to sit beside you without speaking. That morning the air smelled of sagebrush and sea salt. A donkey brayed in the distance. Farther off, a wooden bell clinked where goats grazed along a sun-dappled slope. The earth was dry but not cracked, and the wind came not in gusts, but in soft currents that passed gently through linen and olive leaf alike. Socrates began writing. Not a treatise, not a question, not even an argument. Just a letter to her. Myrene, I woke early again today, though I think the bees may have beaten me. The rosemary has begun to bloom. Small blue blossoms, barely there, like pieces of sky that forgot to float upward. You'd be pleased to know the lemon tree is recovering. I fed it ash, just as you once did. The roots are holding more tightly now, and the leaves have darkened. Do you remember the spring we tried to make fig vinegar? You called it a disaster, but I recall laughing more that week than any other. There is a jug of it still in your storeroom. I tasted it. Still terrible, but I'll keep it anyway. Yours. He didn't seal the letter, didn't roll it or store it with the others. He placed it under the stone slab beneath the olive tree, where the roots pressed close to the earth and the wind could lift the edges. Over the following days, the ritual continued. Each morning, a new letter. Each evening, a return to that spot, where the sea could be seen bending endlessly into the horizon. But these were not letters of sadness. They were not written in mourning. They were instead an extension of the conversations they had once shared. She had always asked him how his mind worked, what he noticed in the market, what people said when they thought no one listened. He had spoken to her more easily than he had to most students. He never felt the need to teach her, only to include her. So now he included her still. Myrene, the boy with the missing front tooth, brought me a bundle of wild thyme today. Said he picked it from the ridge above the olive press. It was tied with a shoelace. I didn't ask whose. I think he likes the bees. I think the bees like him. You would have told me not to interfere, to let the child and the bees figure it out together. So I said nothing. But I watched. Kia and the Aegean beyond it unfolded gently across his senses. The land never shouted. It simply revealed itself more with each quiet day. The hills were covered with olive trees whose trunks twisted like old dancers frozen mid-step. Wild herbs grew in tangled families: oregano, lavender, pennyroyal. Dry stone walls lined every field, each one laid without mortar, and yet they held a lesson, perhaps, in how structure doesn't always need force. There were beaches too, though not the kind that poets often wrote of. Not grand crescents of sand, but modest inlets lined with stones, where waves played lightly with pebbles and seabirds napped beside driftwood. Socrates would sometimes walk there after finishing his letters, his sandals slung in one hand, feet bare to the cool water. He didn't swim. He just stood, ankle deep, letting the tide tug gently at his calves. One afternoon, he found a smooth stone shaped like a crescent moon. He placed it near the olive tree without a word. He didn't explain it in a letter. He didn't need to. Myrene, there is a cat who has adopted your garden. At first, I thought it was looking for mice. But now I believe it simply prefers the rosemary patch. It sleeps there most of the afternoon. I have not named it. You would have, of course. You always insisted that naming things didn't mean owning them, only recognizing them. Sometimes I wonder what you would have named me if I hadn't already come with a name. The villagers had stopped referring to him as the philosopher. Now they called him simply O Xenos O Isaikos, the quiet stranger. He had no need to correct them. He no longer felt like a philosopher, not in the Athenian sense. He no longer needed to dismantle arguments or uncover false logic. Here, wisdom came not from challenge, but from patience. One evening, a small gathering was held in the square. No particular reason, only that the weather was kind and someone had extra wine. A lyre was played. Children danced in crooked circles. Bread was passed from hand to hand. Socrates sat on the edge of the gathering, sipping wine slowly from a wooden cup. A woman asked if he would sing. He declined, but he told a story. Not a parable, not a myth, but a memory. About the time he and Myrene had tried to keep bees from building a hive in the chimney, and how she'd spoken to them in a kind of rhythm, tapping on the clay like a drummer calling dancers home. The children laughed. One girl asked, "Did the bees listen?" "They did," Socrates said, but only to her. Afterward, he walked home slowly, the sky dark above, the stars sharpened by the clarity of the sea air. He lit a small lamp and sat beneath the olive tree. No letter tonight, just silence. And the wind. "Myrene, I've stopped asking where you went. I think I've begun to ask where you stayed." You're in the way I sit now, legs folded, not crossed. In the way I touch the leaves before I cut them. In the way I wait before I speak. They say the dead are gone. But you are not gone. You are rooted, like this tree. And I am learning how to remain. It rained for 2 days, not with thunder or drama, just a soft, steady rhythm that settled over the village like a heavy blanket. The garden soaked it in. The bees stayed hidden. Socrates stayed indoors. He moved slowly through his routines. Boiled lentils, peeled garlic the way Myrene used to, one clove at a time, never rushed. He sliced the bread at an angle, just like her. No one told him to. But that's how love lives on. In habits, not memory. When the rain stopped, the island felt washed clean. The soil was dark, the herbs fragrant. Socrates walked barefoot through the garden, stopping by the olive tree to write again. Not a lesson, not a letter, just a thought. The rain quieted everything, so I peeled the cloves, slowly, and felt the rain waiting with me. He didn't fold the page. He let the wind touch it. People in the village brought him things now. Bay leaves, lemon blossoms, silence. They didn't come for wisdom, they came for company. He welcomed them, not as a teacher, but as someone who knew how to sit still. By then, even his writing had changed. I'm no longer searching for meaning. These days ask only to be held, like a warm cup, with both hands. And he did. After many quiet weeks on Chaea, Socrates felt it, a soft, steady pull to return to the city. Not out of restlessness, not out of duty, but because something had settled in him. He visited Myrene's garden one last time. It had grown, not wildly, but confidently. The rosemary thrived. The lemon tree had new buds. He buried the letters he had written to her beside the rosemary bush. No markings, just stillness. The journey back to Athens was slow. The sea calm. The city greeted him with its usual noise, voices rising in debate, merchants calling prices, sandals tapping over worn stone. But he no longer felt called to join in. He walked through it all with the stillness of someone who had stopped needing to be heard. At the sculptor's quarter, he paused to watch a boy carve a fisherman's curved back in marble. At the Agora, he listened to students discuss the theories of Democritus and Anaxagoras, the humors, the atoms, the soul. He said nothing. He simply listened. Later, in the painter's quarter, a boy painted an olive branch. Socrates leaned down and said softly, "It changes with the season, but something of it always returns." That evening, back in his quiet home, he lit a lamp and said aloud the names of the herbs in Myrene's garden, not as memory, but as prayer. Marjoram, sage, lavender, rosemary. He sat at his table and smiled. The city hadn't changed, but he had. The Agora had not changed. Stone walkways still bore the same indentations, made by carts and footsteps, smoothed by rain and sandals. The vendors still called out in practiced tones, naming their goods like poets announcing stanzas. Figs, olives, honey, cured fish, painted pottery, all neatly arranged as they had always been, like offerings on altars made of trade and routine. And yet to Socrates, the market now felt different. He walked its rows not as someone moving through the world, but as someone letting the world pass through him. He didn't inspect the olives. He didn't argue about the price of cheese. He didn't try to catch the eye of an old pupil. Instead, he wandered slowly, hands folded behind his back, eyes lowered but present. Every voice seemed louder than before, every motion faster. He didn't resent it. He didn't judge. But he felt for the first time like a river stone, shaped by time, no longer trying to resist the current, only to be part of its story. At the western edge of the market, a group of students gathered around a man lecturing on medicine. They spoke of Hippocrates and his theories of the humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Health, they said, was a matter of balance. Socrates listened from a distance. He had once debated physicians here. He had once argued that no body could be healed if the soul remained ill. He had once drawn diagrams in the dirt to prove it. But today, he only watched. He admired the way the teacher moved his hands, not like a man presenting facts, but like someone kneading dough, gently, repetitively, patiently. Later, near the fountain, a young woman argued with a fishmonger. Not about price, but about justice. "You charged him less," she said, pointing to an older man who had just left. "Why is his coin worth more?" The fishmonger grunted. "Because he comes every week. You're new." She crossed her arms. "So fairness has a history?" The fishmonger looked surprised. Then he laughed. "Everything does." Socrates sat on the edge of the fountain and smiled. He didn't add a comment. He didn't pose a riddle. He just listened. He remembered something Myrene once said while pruning lavender. Most people don't need answers. They need to hear their own thoughts spoken aloud. He stayed at the fountain for some time. A group of children ran by, chasing one another with laurel branches. A goat escaped a cart and was wrangled with more laughter than panic. A woman dropped a jar, and the entire square seemed to hold its breath until it didn't break. She laughed and lifted it, victorious. Everyone around her exhaled. Athens was still alive. But Socrates no longer felt the need to shape its thoughts. Instead, he carried his own like a small garden in his chest. That afternoon, he wandered into the painter's quarter. Easels lined the alleys, where students painted the faces of one another in ochre and charcoal. One painted a hand, another a loaf of bread on a wooden table. Still life. Simple forms, repetition. He leaned over a boy painting a single olive branch on parchment. The detail was exquisite. Veins in each leaf, the lightest shading at the edges. The boy looked up, startled. "I used to think of olives as food," Socrates said gently. "But now I think they're memory." The boy blinked. "Memory?" He nodded. "The branch changes, season by season, but something of it always returns, even when it looks bare." The boy said nothing, but his next brushstroke was slower. That evening, Socrates returned to his home. He lit a lamp and placed a bowl of olives on the table. Not because he was hungry, but because he wanted the scent, sharp, briny, sun-dried. He thought of the market, the shouting, the arguing, the buying, the endless motion. He did not resent it, but he did not belong to it either. He belonged to something quieter now. He belonged to gestures, not declarations. He belonged to the way Myrene had once cupped a bee in her palm and whispered, "You're not lost. You're just early." He sat near the window and opened a piece of parchment, not to write, just to smooth it out, just to hold it. He looked at his hands, more wrinkled now, but still steady. He placed them on the table and listened to the silence of the room. And in that silence he heard the market, its hum, its chaos, not as noise, but as rhythm, not as something to correct, but something to witness. Not every wise man needs a podium. Some simply sit at a fountain and let the world continue. And when a child passes with laurel in her hair and questions in her voice, he does not answer. He listens, and he smiles. The olive grove near the academy hadn't changed. The twisted trees still cast long shadows in the evening light, their leaves shimmering in soft silver under the setting sun. Socrates walked among them without hurry, the earth soft underfoot from the recent rain. He had been here many times before, as a teacher, a questioner, a challenge to others. But now he came as a listener. He sat beneath a familiar tree, not far from where he once lectured. No students gathered now. No debates echoed through the grove. Just the breeze, the creak of branches, and the occasional chirp of unseen birds. He took the small wooden bee from his cloak, the one Myrene had carved for him on the island, and held it in his palm for a long while. He thought about her, about how she had taught him more through silence and presence than any argument ever had. He placed the carving at the base of the olive tree, not to bury it, just to let it rest. As the sun slipped below the hills, Socrates stayed seated. He didn't search for meaning. He didn't reflect on legacy. He just breathed with the trees, with the earth, and with the memory of love that no longer asked anything of him, only to remain. There comes a point, not in a man's life, but in a man's attention, when the questions that once burned like fire begin to flicker more gently, not because they're answered, but because they no longer demand to be. Socrates now found himself living in this gentler flame. He still walked the streets of Athens, still visited the groves, still sat in the shaded corners of the market and watched the same people doing the same things he had once done, or taught, or debated. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt the need to intervene. Instead, he simply observed the beautiful strangeness of people trying to make sense of their days, in commerce, in laughter, in brief arguments about justice or onions. He had returned from the island with no proclamations, no new philosophy, only a quiet awareness. And that had proven to be enough. There was a small space behind his house, one that had gone unused for years, little more than a patch of dirt hemmed in by clay brick walls, a forgotten garden or the memory of one. He began to tend it. Not daily, not methodically, just when the soil felt like company. He brought over cuttings from the agora, basil stems that were being discarded, a fig seed given to him by a young boy selling pastries. A neighbor gifted him a clay pot filled with garlic cloves and said, "These grew too small to sell, but they still have taste." That was enough. Within a month, the garden had begun to breathe again, not to flourish, but to breathe. The mint crept along the corners. The basil reached upward. Even the garlic began to split the soil like a whispered sentence finally spoken. He found joy in watering, in touching, in waiting. Sometimes, as he leaned over the plants, a memory would drift through him, not like a wound, but like a breeze carrying scent. He'd remember Myrene bent over her own rose, her thumb breaking apart the clumps of soil, her voice naming herbs aloud, even when no one was around to hear. He didn't weep. He smiled. She had taught him, not through lectures, not through reason, but through repetition, through consistency, through the kind of presence that asked for nothing and gave everything. She had lived as bees live, fully, quietly, purposefully. One day a young student approached him as he sat outside with a jar of olive oil and bread. "I heard you were Socrates," the boy said. Socrates looked up and tilted his head. "And who are you?" "I'm no one yet," the boy answered. "But I want to ask what the wisest thing is you've ever learned." Socrates chewed his bread slowly, swallowed, and said, "That people will forget your words before they forget how you waited for them to finish speaking." The boy blinked. "That's not what I expected." "It rarely is," Socrates replied. The boy asked if he could visit again. Socrates said yes, not because he intended to teach him anything, but because he had learned in recent seasons that listening was its own form of legacy. Spring turned slowly to summer. The garden pressed upward. The figs grew heavy. The basil flowered too soon, and Socrates let it, white blossoms spilling onto the wall like a decision left unresolved. In the evenings, he sat outside and wrote on scraps of parchment. Sometimes it was a sentence, sometimes a memory. Often it was just a question. What does the wind know that I do not? Why do children remember kindness more than they remember instructions? What does it mean to love someone who is no longer asking to be loved? He did not collect these writings. He left them on the windowsill. Some blew away. Some became part of the compost. One was found by a neighbor's child and read aloud like a poem. He didn't mind. One morning he woke earlier than usual. The light had just begun to thread its way into the room, soft and golden, like butter across warmed bread. There was no sound yet, no dogs, no footsteps, only the quiet tick of his own breathing. He sat up, dressed slowly, and stepped outside. The garden greeted him with scent, mint crushed underfoot, figs beginning to split open with ripeness, garlic pushing upward like tiny truths. He walked barefoot across the soil, not to work, not to gather, just to be there. He sat beneath the crooked lemon tree he had planted 2 years before, and he listened. He listened to the silence. He listened to the city as it woke. He listened to the bees. He listened to Myrene, not her voice, but her absence, which by now had become something warm, almost physical, a companion. And in that stillness, he asked himself softly, "If this is the end, is it enough?" And he smiled, because the answer didn't need to be spoken. It was already in the garden, in the mint, in the soil beneath his feet, in the love he had carried, not as grief, but as habit. They say Socrates left no writings of his own. Perhaps that's true, but maybe he left something else. Maybe he left silence where there had once been noise, stillness where there had been challenge, softness where there had once been certainty. Maybe his greatest wisdom was never uttered in the agora, but felt in a garden after rain. Maybe the questions that mattered most were the ones he never answered, because he was too busy listening, because he had learned, at last, that some truths, like garlic, like bees, like love, grow quietly when given time, when left in peace. The end. Drifting with Socrates. A calm journey through quiet days, lost love, and the Aegean wind.